Montana Territory, 1874. The dust of the late summer hung in the air, painting the small frontier town of Whispering Pines in a golden haze as the setting sun stretched long shadows across the main street. Zara Kingsley stood on the porch of the modest boarding house she had called home for the past 3 weeks, her delicate hands resting on the weathered railing as she watched the usual evening commotion with weary blue eyes. At 22, she possessed a beauty that seemed out of place in such a rough-hewn settlement, honey-blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, with rebellious tendrils framing a face that had known both hardship and grace. Her simple cotton dress, once a vibrant blue but now faded to the color of a winter sky, hung on her slender frame, mended in places that only her keen eye would notice. Zara had come to believe that the frontier was a place where dreams came to die, where survival was the only currency that mattered, and where love was a luxury that people like her could ill afford. The bitter lessons of her past had taught her that much. Trust was dangerous out here, and opening her heart again would be nothing short of foolish. She had learned to depend only on herself, to expect nothing, and to view the world through the lens of what could be lost rather than what might be gained. The stagecoach rumbled into town with its usual cacophony of creaking wood, jangling harnesses, and the thunderous hoofbeats of the 4-horse team. Zara watched without particular interest as it pulled to a stop before the town's only hotel across the street. These weekly arrivals rarely brought anything of consequence to her life, just mail, supplies, and occasionally new faces that would soon blend into the backdrop of frontier existence. As the coach door swung open, a tall figure emerged, ducking slightly under the frame before straightening to his full height. Even from across the street, there was something about him that caught Zara's attention, perhaps the confident yet unassuming way he moved, or how he paused to thank the driver before retrieving his modest belongings. He wore the typical attire of a working cowboy: denim trousers, a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal tanned forearms, and a worn Stetson that he removed briefly to run a hand through dark hair before replacing it on his head. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner, stepped onto the porch beside Zara, wiping her hands on her apron. "That must be Mr. Irwin," she said, following Zara's gaze. "Garrett Irwin. He sent a letter last week asking about room and board, coming to work at the Rocking M Ranch for Mr. Montgomery." Zara nodded absently, ready to dismiss the newcomer from her thoughts. Another cowboy in a town full of them was hardly noteworthy. She had a kitchen to clean before morning, biscuits to prepare for breakfast, and laundry to finish, the endless tasks that defined her existence and kept her employed. "He'll be staying here," Mrs. Holloway continued. "I hope you don't mind setting an extra place at dinner. He should be over shortly after he checks in with Sheriff Davis." Zara's expression remained neutral, though inwardly she sighed. Another mouth to feed, another man tracking mud onto her clean floors. "Of course, Mrs. Holloway, I'll see to it." The older woman patted Zara's arm with motherly affection. "You're such a blessing, dear. I don't know what I'd do without you." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And he's quite handsome, isn't he? Not like some of these rough types that come through." "I hadn't noticed," Zara lied, turning toward the door. "I'll go add water to the stew." Inside, as Zara moved efficiently around the kitchen, her domain in this small world she inhabited, she found herself inexplicably thinking about the stranger. It had been a long time since she'd given any man a second thought. 3 years, to be precise. 3 years since she'd buried her fiancé David after outlaws had killed him in a senseless robbery. 3 years of building walls around her heart, of convincing herself that love was a weakness she could not afford, especially not out here where death lurked around every corner. She had come west with dreams of adventure and a future with David, only to find herself alone, working as a cook and housekeeper to survive. Practical skills were what mattered on the frontier, not tender feelings. Zara could cook a meal that would make a grown man weep with gratitude. She could clean a house until it sparkled despite the ever-present dust. She could mend clothing, tend gardens, even assist with basic medical needs. These abilities kept her fed and housed. Love had only ever brought her pain. As she stirred the rich beef stew, adding another cup of water and a handful more of vegetables to stretch the meal for their new boarder. Zara heard the front door open, followed by Mrs. Holloway's cheerful greeting. The deep, warm timbre of a male voice responded, its cadence different from the local drawl, softer somehow, with an educated lilt that seemed at odds with his cowboy appearance. "Miss Kingsley is the finest cook in 3 counties," Mrs. Holloway was saying as they approached the kitchen. "You're fortunate to have arrived in time for her stew." Zara straightened her apron and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, irritated at herself for the gesture the moment she'd done it. What did it matter what this stranger thought of her appearance? They entered the kitchen, and Zara turned to greet the new boarder with the polite but distant smile she reserved for all men. "Welcome to Whispering Pines, Mr. Irwin. Dinner will be ready shortly." Up close, Garrett Irwin was more striking than she had initially observed. He couldn't have been more than 25, with clear hazel eyes that regarded her with unexpected warmth. His face was clean-shaven save for the slightest shadow along his jawline, evidence of a day's travel. His features were well-formed, straight nose, strong jaw, and lips that seemed naturally inclined to smile. He removed his hat in her presence, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Miss Kingsley," he said with a slight bow of his head, "the pleasure is mine. That smells absolutely wonderful." There was something disarming about the genuine appreciation in his voice, lacking the gruff entitlement she'd grown accustomed to from most men. Zara found herself momentarily at a loss for words, an unusual state for someone who prided herself on maintaining composure. "It's just stew," she finally managed, turning back to the pot. "Nothing special. I've spent enough nights eating my own cooking on the trail to know better," he replied with a soft chuckle. "There's stew and then there's stew. That smells like the kind a man remembers." "Mrs. Holloway beamed as if he'd complimented her directly. "I'll show you to your room now, Mr. Irwin. You can get settled before dinner. We eat at 6 sharp." As they left the kitchen, Zara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something about Garrett Irwin unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Perhaps it was simply that he didn't fit her expectations. Cowboys, in her experience, were typically rough-spoken, weather-beaten men who treated women like either delicate flowers or convenient servants. This man had looked at her as if truly seeing her, with a respect that seemed as natural as breathing. It meant nothing, she reminded herself firmly. He was just passing through her life as everyone did. She had learned the hard way not to form attachments. In this world, people left whether by choice or by death. Better to keep her distance and protect the fragile peace she had constructed for herself. That evening at dinner, Zara served the meal and then took her customary place at the far end of the table. Besides Mrs. Holloway and now Garrett, there were 4 other boarders. Mr. Peterson, the aging storekeeper, the Williams brothers, Seth and Samuel, who worked at the livery, and Miss Abigail Green, the town's schoolteacher. The conversation flowed around Zara as it always did, with the others curious about the newcomer. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Irwin?" Mr. Peterson asked between mouthfuls of stew. Garrett finished chewing before answering, his manners noticeably refined for a cowhand. "I've been hired as foreman at the Rocking M. Mr. Montgomery is expanding his operation, and my previous employer gave me a recommendation." "Montgomery's a good man," Samuel Williams nodded approvingly. "Fair wages doesn't work a man to death. Where were you before?" "Colorado mostly, worked a few spreads there, then up in Wyoming for a spell." Garrett's eyes momentarily met Zara's across the table. "This is truly exceptional, Miss Kingsley." Zara nodded her acknowledgement of the compliment but said nothing. She had perfected the art of being present yet apart, of existing on the periphery of conversation without being drawn in. "Zara doesn't just cook," Mrs. Holloway said proudly. "She keeps this whole house running, never seen hands so capable." "Is that so?" Garrett asked, his interest seemingly genuine. Something about his direct gaze made Zara uncomfortable. Most people respected her silent boundaries, but he seemed intent on breaching them. "Mrs. Holloway exaggerates," she replied quietly. "I simply do what needs doing." "That's a rare quality," Garrett said. seeing what needs to be done and having the skill to do it. The conversation shifted to local matters, the coming harvest, news from the territorial capital, rumors of railroad expansion that might someday reach their isolated community. Throughout the meal, Zara was aware of Garrett's occasional glances in her direction, though he didn't attempt to draw her out again. When dinner concluded, Zara rose to clear the dishes. To her surprise, Garrett stood as well, gathering plates from his end of the table. "You don't need to do that, Mr. Irwin," she said stiffly. "My mother raised me to help clear when I've been fed well," he replied simply, following her into the kitchen with his arms full of dishes. In the kitchen, he set the stack carefully on the counter near the washing basin. Instead of leaving, however, he rolled up his sleeves. "I can dry if you'd like to wash." Zara stared at him, nonplussed. "That's not necessary." "Not necessary," he agreed with an easy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, "but it would make the work go faster, wouldn't it?" She couldn't argue with that logic, though something in her rebelled against accepting help. Independence had become her armor, and any crack in it felt dangerous. "Very well," she conceded reluctantly, handing him a clean towel. They worked in silence for several minutes, Zara washing each dish thoroughly before passing it to Garrett, who dried with unexpected efficiency. There was something comforting about the rhythm they fell into, though Zara was careful not to let herself enjoy it too much. "Have you been in Whispering Pines long?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. "Nearly a year." She kept her answer short, hoping to discourage further inquiry. Garrett nodded, accepting the next plate. "It seems like a decent town, quiet." "Mostly?" Zara's hand stilled momentarily as memories flickered through her mind, gunshots in the night, a funeral procession, a young widow's wails. She pushed the thoughts away, though everywhere has its troubles. "That's the truth." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with such troubles, but he didn't elaborate and she didn't ask. When the last dish was dried and put away, Garrett hung the towel neatly on its hook. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Kingsley. I haven't eaten so well in a long time." His sincerity was disarming. "You're welcome, Mr. Irwin." He hesitated at the kitchen door, seeming on the verge of saying something more, but then simply nodded and left. Zara released a breath, unsure why the simple interaction had left her feeling so unsettled. There was something about Garrett Irwin that pulled at her, a quiet strength that made her want to lower her guard, and that made him dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat. Over the next 2 weeks, Garrett settled into life at the boarding house and his position at the Rocking M Ranch. He left early each morning, often before dawn, and returned in time for the evening meal, occasionally bringing small gifts for the house, wildflowers for the table, fresh honey from a beekeeper he'd met, once even a rabbit he'd hunted that Zara transformed into a savory stew. Each evening, he helped her clear the table and dry the dishes, their conversation gradually expanding beyond brief exchanges. Zara learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had passed when he was 15. He had a quiet intelligence that belied his frontier occupation, often referencing books or expressing thoughts that revealed a contemplative nature. Despite her determination to maintain her emotional distance, Zara found herself looking forward to their evening ritual, to the peaceful moments in the kitchen when the day's work was done and the boarding house had quieted. She caught herself watching the clock as 6 approached, wondering if Garrett would arrive with that warm smile that seemed reserved just for her. It was dangerous territory, she knew. The fragile peace she had constructed for herself was being threatened by these small kindnesses, these moments of connection she hadn't allowed herself in years. Yet she couldn't seem to stop the slow thawing of the ice around her heart. On a Saturday afternoon in early September, Zara was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard the distinctive sound of hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see Garrett riding toward the house, his horse at an easy trot. He wasn't due back for hours yet, and curiosity flickered through her. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, tying his horse to the hitching post before approaching her with that now familiar smile. "Afternoon, Miss Kingsley." "Mr. Irwin, you're back early." She continued pinning a sheet to the line, trying to ignore how the sunlight brought out golden flecks in his hazel eyes. Mr. Montgomery gave me the rest of the day. He hesitated, removing his hat and turning it in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. There's to be a social at the church tonight. A harvest celebration of sorts. Zara nodded, reaching for another piece of laundry. Mrs. Holloway mentioned it. She's made 3 pies to bring. I was wondering, he continued, his usual confidence seemingly diminished, if you might consider attending. With me. Her hands stilled on the damp fabric. With you. As my guest, yes. His eyes held her steadily, despite the uncertainty in his voice. Zara looked away, busying herself with the laundry again. I don't attend such gatherings, Mr. Irwin. May I ask why not? Because they reminded her of happier times, of dances with David, of a future that had been snatched away. Because watching others' happiness only highlighted what she had lost. Because allowing herself moments of joy felt like a betrayal of her grief. I prefer to spend my evenings quietly, she said instead. But thank you for the invitation. Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded acceptance. Of course, I understand. He didn't understand, not really, but Zara appreciated that he didn't press the issue. She had rebuffed other invitations over the past year, from well-meaning townspeople who thought a social gathering might cheer her up or help her move on. None had accepted her refusal with such grace. Garrett replaced his hat, preparing to leave, when the sound of approaching wagons drew their attention to the street. 3 covered wagons were rolling into town, accompanied by several riders on horseback, a small wagon train that had clearly weathered a difficult journey. Even from a distance, Zara could see the weary postures of the travelers, the oxen plodding as if on their last reserves of strength. They look like they've had a hard time of it, Garrett observed, his brow furrowing with concern. Without conscious thought, Zara untied her apron. They'll need food and water. They moved together toward the front of the house, as the wagons came to a stop in the town's central square. Other townspeople were emerging from shops and homes, drawn by the arrival. Sheriff Davis was already approaching the lead wagon, speaking with a bearded man who appeared to be in charge of the group. As Zara and Garrett reached the square, the full state of the travelers became apparent. There were perhaps 20 people total, including several children, all bearing the gaunt, haunted look of those who had faced death on the trail. One of the wagons had been clearly repaired after damage, its canvas patched in multiple places. Outlaws hit them near the pass, Sheriff Davis announced to the gathering crowd, took most of their supplies, killed 2 men. They've been traveling short rations for nearly 2 weeks. A murmur of sympathy ran through the onlookers. Frontier hospitality was an unwritten law. No one turned away those in genuine need. Within moments, the town was mobilizing. Men moved to help with the animals and wagons. Women began discussing where the travelers could be housed. Mrs. Holloway pushed through the crowd toward Zara. We can take in 1 family at the boarding house. The Pattersons have 3 small children. They should have proper beds. Zara nodded, already mentally calculating how to stretch their food supplies. I'll start preparing something for all of them to eat now. They look half-starved. I'll help, Garrett offered immediately, and I can speak to Mr. Montgomery about provisions from the ranch. They've just slaughtered a steer. For the next several hours, Whispering Pines transformed into a hive of activity as the townspeople rallied to aid the beleaguered travelers. Zara worked tirelessly in the kitchen, cooking enormous pots of stew and baking bread, while Garrett rode to the ranch and returned with a wagon loaded with beef, flour, and other supplies donated by his employer. As darkness fell, the church social was forgotten as the town gathered instead in the town square for an impromptu community meal to welcome the travelers and hear their stories. Tables had been set up under the stars, laden with food contributed from every household. Zara found herself working alongside Garrett, serving the hungry travelers. She watched as he knelt to speak Aitwai with a solemn-faced little boy, somehow coaxing a smile from the child. She observed the gentle way he helped an elderly woman to a seat, ensuring she had a cushion for her back before filling her plate with the most tender portions of meat. "You're good with them," she commented softly when they had a moment apart from the others. Garrett shrugged, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. "They've been through hell. Kindness costs nothing." Not everyone understands that. She had seen too many frontier settlements where strangers were viewed with suspicion rather than compassion. "My father always said that the measure of civilization isn't in buildings or laws, but in how we treat those in need." His expression grew distant for a moment. He would have liked this town. As the evening progressed, the mood gradually lightened. Someone produced a fiddle, and despite their exhaustion, a few of the travelers joined some townspeople in dance. Children who had been listless hours before now ran playing between the tables, their resilience a testament to the human spirit. Zara stood at the edge of the gathering, watching. This wasn't the formal social she had refused to attend, but somehow she had ended up part of a community celebration anyway. The irony wasn't lost on her. She felt rather than saw Garrett approach, coming to stand quietly beside her. "Not exactly how I pictured spending the evening," he said, a smile in his voice, "but better in many ways." Zara nodded, watching as Mrs. Patterson danced with her youngest child in her arms, the woman's face alight with relief and gratitude. They might have died without help. But they didn't. Garrett's shoulder brushed against hers, warm and solid in the cooling evening air. "Because people like you saw what needed doing and did it." The simple praise warmed something inside her that had been cold for too long. She had acted out of necessity, out of human decency, but hearing him frame it as something admirable made her see her own actions differently. The fiddle transitioned to a slower tune, and several couples moved together in a simple waltz. Without thinking, Zara swayed slightly to the music, a muscle memory from happier times. "Would you dance with me, Miss Kingsley?" Garrett's voice was soft, tentative, as if expecting refusal. Her first instinct was to decline, to retreat behind her carefully constructed walls. But something about the night, the stars overhead, the community coming together, the reminder of how precious and precarious life on the frontier could be, made her hesitate. "Just one dance," she heard herself say. The surprise and pleasure that transformed his face was almost enough to make the risk worthwhile. He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed hers within it. He led her to the edge of the makeshift dance floor, away from the center of attention. His hand was warm at her waist, respectful in its light touch, and when they began to move to the music, she discovered that he danced well, confident without being showy. "I haven't done this in a long time," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the fiddle. "You dance beautifully," he replied, guiding her through a gentle turn. For a few precious minutes, Zara allowed herself to simply be in the moment, to feel the music, to appreciate the respectful strength of Garrett's lead, to exist without the weight of her past pressing down upon her. It was a dangerous indulgence, she knew, but one her heart had apparently decided to allow. When the music ended, Garrett stepped back, releasing her hand with obvious reluctance. "Thank you, Miss Kingsley." The formal address, which had seemed appropriate when they first met, now felt like an artificial barrier between them. "Zara," she said impulsively, "my name is Zara." His smile could have outshone the stars. "Zara," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Thank you, Zara." That night, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the Patterson children sleeping in the room next door, Zara confronted the truth she had been avoiding. She was drawn to Garrett Irwin in a way she had not been drawn to anyone since David. The realization terrified her. Opening herself to such feelings again meant making herself vulnerable to loss, to the kind of pain that had nearly destroyed her once before. And yet, watching how he had responded to the travelers in need, how he brought the same careful attention to helping others that he did to his work, how his kindness flowed without expectation of return, these things had awakened something in her she had believed dead. A possibility, a question. Was it worth the risk to feel again, knowing what it could cost? The following week brought a shift in the weather, the first hint of autumn crispness tempering the late summer heat. The travelers had moved on after 3 days of rest and resupply, continuing their journey west with renewed provisions and spirits. Life in Whispering Pines returned to its normal rhythms, though Zara found herself changed in subtle ways she couldn't fully articulate. She was more aware of the world beyond her tasks, more present in conversations at the dinner table, more willing to meet Garrett's eyes when he smiled at her across the room. Small changes, perhaps unnoticeable to others, but to Zara they represented cracks in the fortress she had built around herself. On Wednesday afternoon, as she was returning from purchasing supplies at the general store, she encountered Garrett riding into town at an unusual hour. His expression was grim, his usual warm demeanor replaced by a tense vigilance that immediately put her on alert. "What's happened?" she asked as he dismounted beside her. Trouble, his voice was low, meant only for her ears despite the relatively empty street. "The Blackwell gang has been spotted in the area. Sheriff Davis is gathering men to form a patrol." A cold knot formed in Zara's stomach. The Blackwell gang was notorious throughout the territory, ruthless outlaws responsible for numerous robberies, killings, and assaults. They were the same gang that had murdered David 3 years before. "Are they coming here?" Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Garrett's eyes narrowed at her reaction. "Not certain. They hit a stagecoach 20 miles north yesterday. Killed the driver and a passenger, took everything of value. They were seen heading in this direction." Her fingers tightened convulsively on the package she carried. "The sheriff needs to send telegrams to the surrounding settlements. They need to be warned." "Already done." Garrett studied her face. "Zara, are you all right? You've gone pale." She couldn't tell him, not here, not now. The words would choke her. "I should get these supplies back to Mrs. Holloway." He looked as if he wanted to press further but nodded instead. "I need to speak with the sheriff. I'll be back for dinner if we don't ride out before then." The thought of Garrett facing the Blackwell gang sent a spike of fear through her that was so intense it left her breathless. "Be careful," she managed to say. "Always am." He attempted a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes before mounting his horse and continuing toward the sheriff's office. Zara stood frozen for a long moment, the past and present colliding with devastating force. The Blackwells, here. The monsters from her nightmares were suddenly real again, threatening not just her carefully reconstructed peace, but also the man who had begun to matter to her despite her best efforts to remain detached. When she finally forced herself to move, her steps were mechanical, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. What if history repeated itself? What if Garrett rode out to face these men and never returned? What if she was left alone again, with even more regret for the things left unsaid, the feelings never expressed? By the time she reached the boarding house, her hands were trembling so badly that Mrs. Holloway noticed immediately. "Child, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." In some ways she had. "The Blackwell gang has been spotted nearby," she said, setting down her package before she dropped it. "Garrett, Mr. Irwin, just brought the news." "Mrs." Holloway's hand flew to her mouth. "Lord have mercy." "Those devils." She crossed the room to place a steadying hand on Zara's arm. "Sit down before you fall down, dear. I'll make you some tea." Zara sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "The sheriff is gathering men to form a patrol." "Of course he is, that's his job." Mrs. Holloway filled the kettle and set it on the stove, her movements brisk and practical despite the worry lines etched around her eyes. "Though I pray they don't find anything. Those outlaws are killers, every last one of them." "I know," Zara whispered. Something in her tone made the older woman turn to look at her more closely. "You've had dealings with them before." It wasn't a question, but Zara nodded anyway. 3 years ago in Colorado." She swallowed hard. "They killed my fiancé, David. We were traveling to meet his brother in Denver. They stopped our stagecoach, took everything. David tried to protect me and they shot him." The words tumbled out, the story she hadn't told anyone in Whispering Pines finally finding voice. "I held him while he died. There was so much blood." Mrs. Holloway's face crumpled with compassion. "Oh, my dear girl, I had no idea." "No one here knows." Zara stared at her hands, remembering how they had been stained red that day, how she had scrubbed and scrubbed but still felt the blood on them for weeks afterward. "I came west to start a new life with him, and instead I buried him in a town where I knew no one. I wandered for months before ending up here." The older woman abandoned the tea preparations to sit beside Zara, taking her cold hands between warm, work-roughened palms. And now those same men are nearby, and you're afraid. Not for myself. The realization struck Zara with surprising force. For Garrett, for the town, I can't lose, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Mrs. Holloway's eyes softened with understanding. You care for him. It wasn't a question, but Zara found herself answering anyway. I didn't want to, I tried not to. She drew a shaky breath. When David died, I promised myself I would never feel that way again. The pain was too much. Love is always a risk, child, especially out here, Mrs. Holloway squeezed her hands gently. But a life without it is no life at all, just existence. The kettle began to whistle, but neither woman moved to attend to it for a long moment. Finally, Mrs. Holloway rose with a sigh and removed it from the heat. Does he know about your past? Zara shook her head. I've never told him. I've barely spoken to anyone about it since it happened. Perhaps you should. The older woman poured the hot water into a teapot. Not everyone gets a second chance at happiness, Zara. Some of us lose our loves and never find another. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity but with the weight of lived experience, struck Zara deeply. Mrs. Holloway had been a widow for over a decade, had raised 3 children alone, had built a life that was meaningful if not the one she had planned. She knew of what she spoke. I'm afraid, Zara admitted, her voice small. Of course you are. Fear is the shadow cast by love. Mrs. Holloway set a steaming cup of tea before her, but shadows cannot exist without light. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety for Zara. She went through the motions of her usual duties, preparing dinner and setting the table, but her mind was elsewhere, with Garrett at the sheriff's office, with the memory of David's final moments, with the terrible fear that history might repeat itself. When dinner time arrived, Garrett had not returned. The meal was a subdued affair, with Mr. Peterson bringing news from town that a patrol of 10 men, including the sheriff and Garrett, had ridden out late in the afternoon to scout the surrounding area for signs of the outlaws. They'll be back by morning, he said, though his tone lacked conviction, unless they pick up a clear trail. Zara barely touched her food, earning concerned glances from Mrs. Holloway. After the meal, she cleared the table mechanically, and for the first time in weeks, she was alone in the kitchen. The absence of Garrett's steady presence as she washed the dishes left an ache in her chest she could no longer deny. As she worked, she imagined what she would say to him if, when he returned. Would she find the courage to tell him about David, about her fears, about the feelings that had begun to grow despite her best efforts to prevent them? Or would she retreat again behind her walls, choosing the safety of isolation over the risk of connection? She was still wrestling with these questions when the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house drew her to the back door. A figure on horseback was silhouetted against the rising moon, and even before he came fully into view, she knew it was Garrett by the way he sat in the saddle. Relief washed over her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. She stepped out onto the back porch, drying her hands on her apron as he dismounted and secured his horse. "You're back," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. He looked up, and even in the dim light, she could see the weariness etched in his features. "Just to report to the townspeople. We'll be heading out again at first light." "Did you find anything?" "Tracks heading east, away from town." He removed his hat, running a hand through hair damp with sweat. "We followed them until it got too dark to see. Sheriff thinks they might be headed for the territorial border." "That's good news, isn't it, if they're moving away from Whispering Pines?" Garrett's expression remained grave. "Maybe. Or they could be circling around to approach from another direction. Blackwell's crafty, known for false trails." The name sent a shiver through Zara, one that Garrett noticed despite the darkness. "Mrs. Holloway told me," he said quietly. "About your fiancé, about what happened to you." Zara stiffened, a flare of betrayal quickly followed by resignation. Of course Mrs. Holloway had told him. The older woman had practically been matchmaking since his arrival. "I wish she hadn't." "I'm glad she did." He took a step closer, his face now visible in the spill of lamplight from the kitchen window. It helps me understand why you've kept everyone at arm's length. Why you've been so determined to remain alone. She looked away, unable to bear the compassion in his eyes. It's not something I like to discuss. I know. Another step brought him to the edge of the porch, looking up at her. But I think maybe it's something you need to discuss, with someone who cares about you. The simple declaration that he cared cracked something open inside her. Tears she had held back for years suddenly threatened, burning behind her eyes. I can't do this again, she whispered. I can't go through that pain again. Zara, just her name, spoken with such tenderness that a tear escaped despite her efforts to contain it. Look at me, please. Reluctantly, she met his gaze. In the gentle light from the window, his eyes were warm with an emotion she had been refusing to acknowledge. I can't promise you that nothing bad will ever happen, he said softly. No one can make that promise out here. But I can promise you that closing yourself off from feeling won't protect you from pain. It will only guarantee that you miss the joy that could be yours. You don't understand. Another tear followed the first. I watched him die. I held him as he bled out. There was nothing I could do. And that haunts you. He climbed the steps slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished. She remained frozen in place. But hiding from life won't honor his memory or heal your heart. He stood before her now, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him after his long ride, could smell the scent of leather and horses and the clean sweat of honest work. When I first came to Whispering Pines, he continued, his voice low and intimate, I was running too, not from grief like you but from mistakes, from a past I wasn't proud of. I thought if I just worked hard enough, kept to myself, I could outrun it. He smiled faintly. And then I met you. Me, the word came out as barely more than a breath. You, with your quiet strength. Your capable hands that create such beauty from simple ingredients. Your eyes that hold so much more than you let people see. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and when she didn't pull away, he gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You made me want to stop running, to be still, to build something lasting. Zara's heart thundered in her chest, his touch leaving a trail of warmth on her skin. I don't know if I can, she admitted. I don't know if I remember how. To love, his question was gentle without pressure or demand. She nodded, unable to voice the word. Maybe it's like riding a horse, he suggested, a hint of that warm smile returning to his eyes. You never really forget. You just need to find the courage to get back in the saddle. Despite everything, her fear, her grief, the danger still lurking beyond the town's boundaries, Zara felt a small laugh escape her. That's a terrible metaphor, Garrett Irwin. His smile broadened at her use of his full name. Maybe, but it made you smile. For a moment they stood suspended in the quiet night, something fragile and precious growing in the space between them. Then the sound of approaching riders broke the spell, and Garrett stepped back, turning toward the street. That'll be the sheriff, he said, his voice regaining its earlier gravity. I should go. Zara nodded, suddenly acutely aware that he would be riding out again tomorrow, pursuing the very men who had destroyed her happiness once before. Will you be careful? He turned back to her, his expression softening. I promised you I always am, and I keep my promises, Zara. With that, he descended the steps and disappeared around the side of the house, leaving her standing on the porch with the echo of his words and the lingering warmth of his touch on her cheek. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, heavy clouds gathering on the horizon as the patrol prepared to ride out again. Zara rose early, preparing a substantial breakfast for the boarders and packing food for Garrett to take with him. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but it was the one thing she could do, ensure he didn't ride out hungry. She met him at the back door as he was preparing to leave, handing him the carefully wrapped package. It's not much. Just biscuits and ham, and some of those apple tarts you like. Garrett accepted the offering with a solemnity that matched the weight she had imbued it with. Thank you, this means a lot. They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite knowing how to navigate this new territory between them. No longer just a boarder and a housekeeper, but not yet. Whatever they might become, I'll be back as soon as I can, he finally said. Zara nodded, fighting the urge to reach for him to ask him not to go. I'll be here. It was a simple statement, but one laden with meaning. I'll be here. Not running away, not hiding behind my walls, here, waiting for you to return. Understanding flickered in his eyes, and he reached out to briefly touch her hand, a ghost of a caress. That's something worth coming back for. Then he was gone, mounting his horse and riding to join the others gathering at the sheriff's office. Zara watched until he disappeared from view, a prayer she hadn't allowed herself in years rising unbidden to her lips. The day stretched endlessly before her, each task taking twice as long as usual as her mind constantly wandered to Garrett and the patrol. Where were they? Had they found the outlaws? Was he safe? By mid-afternoon, a steady rain had begun to fall, further dampening both the town and Zara's spirits. She imagined Garrett out in the downpour, cold and wet, tracking dangerous men through increasingly treacherous conditions. The image made her chest ache with worry. Mrs. Holloway found her staring out the window as she mechanically kneaded bread dough. They'll seek shelter in this weather, the older woman said, correctly interpreting Zara's thoughts. They won't be able to track anything in the rain anyway. Unless they already found them before the storm hit, Zara replied, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Mrs. Holloway squeezed her shoulder gently. You can't think that way, dear. It will drive you mad. Zara nodded, though the worry remained a constant presence, like a physical weight pressing down on her. She forced herself to focus on her tasks, to lose herself in the rhythm of work as she had done for so long. But now, unlike before, her mind refused to empty. Thoughts of Garrett, his smile, his kindness, the gentle way he had touched her cheek, kept intruding, along with the terrible fear that she might lose him just as she was finding the courage to let him in. Evening came with no word from the patrol. Dinner was a subdued affair, with the empty chair at the table a stark reminder of Garrett's absence. Afterward, as Zara washed the dishes alone, the back door suddenly burst open, startling her so badly that she dropped a plate, shattering it on the floor. Sheriff Davis stood in the doorway, dripping with rain, his expression grim. Miss Kingsley, is Mrs. Holloway here? Zara's heart seemed to stop in her chest. What's happened? Is it Garrett? The sheriff's hesitation told her everything before he spoke. There was a confrontation with the Blackwell gang. Irwin's been shot. The room seemed to tilt around her. Is he? She couldn't finish the question. Alive but in bad shape. We've taken him to Doc Miller's. He's working on him now. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway behind Zara, drawn by the commotion. Good Lord, Sheriff, you're soaked through. What's happened? As the sheriff repeated his news, Zara was already untying her apron, moving with a determination that surprised even herself. I'm going to him. Neither the sheriff nor Mrs. Holloway attempted to dissuade her. The older woman simply said, Bring my shawl for the rain, dear, and tell the doctor I'll be along shortly with clean bandages and broth. The walk to the doctor's office was a blur through the pouring rain, Zara's mind racing with terrible possibilities. She had been here before, rushing to the bedside of a man she cared for, praying she wouldn't be too late. The parallel was so exact that it felt like a cruel joke from the universe, as if she were trapped in some terrible cycle doomed to repeat itself. But there was one critical difference, she realized as she hurried through the muddy streets. This time she hadn't yet told Garrett how she felt. This time there were words left unspoken that might never be said. The thought lent urgency to her steps. The doctor's office was lit brightly against the gathering darkness, the front room serving as a waiting area where several rain-soaked members of the patrol sat in grim silence. They looked up as Zara entered, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and exhaustion. How is he? She asked, not caring that her voice shook or that rain dripped from her hair onto the floor. Doc's still working on him, Samuel Williams answered, rising to offer her his chair. Bullet hit him in the shoulder, but he lost a lot of blood before we could get him back to town. Zara sank into the offered seat, her legs suddenly unable to support her. What happened? We tracked them to an abandoned homestead about 15 miles east, Sheriff Davis explained, having followed her from the boarding house. They'd holed up there to wait out the weather. We tried to surround them, but one of them spotted us and opened fire. He scrubbed a hand over his face, leaving a smear of mud. Irwin saved my life, pushed me out of the way of a shot that would have taken my head off. Took the bullet himself. A hero, of course he would be a hero. The knowledge both filled Zara with pride and intensified her fear. She had lost one good man to violence. Was she about to lose another? "Did you catch them?" she asked, needing to know if Garrett's sacrifice had at least accomplished something. The sheriff's expression darkened. "Blackwell and one other got away in the confusion. We captured 3 of them, though. They're locked up tight, awaiting transfer to the territorial prison." Small comfort, but something. Zara nodded, then turned her attention to the closed door that separated them from Garrett and the doctor. "How long has he been in there?" "About an hour," Samuel said. "Doc said it might take a while. The bullet was lodged deep." An hour, an eternity when someone's life hung in the balance. Zara clasped her hands tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking, offering up silent prayers to a God she had nearly stopped believing in after David's death. "Not again," she pleaded. "Please, not again." Minutes stretched into another hour as they waited in tense silence, broken only by occasional murmured conversations among the men. Mrs. Holloway arrived with bandages and food for everyone, giving Zara's shoulder a supportive squeeze before settling in to wait alongside her. Finally, the inner door opened, and Dr. Miller emerged, wiping his hands on a blood-stained towel. His lined face was drawn with fatigue, but when he saw Zara, he offered a small, reassuring nod. "He'll live," he said simply. The relief that flooded through Zara was so intense that tears sprang to her eyes. "Can I see him?" The doctor hesitated, glancing at the others. "He's unconscious still and will be for some time. I had to give him laudanum for the pain, but," he seemed to make a decision. "Yes, you can sit with him for a while. He shouldn't be alone tonight." Zara rose on unsteady legs, following the doctor through the door into the small room that served as his surgery. The smell hit her first, the metallic tang of blood mingled with the sharp scent of antiseptic. Then she saw Garrett, lying still and pale on the examination table, his upper body bare except for the thick bandages wrapped around his left shoulder and chest. He looked younger in unconsciousness, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him before. His usual vitality was replaced by an unnatural stillness that sent fear coursing through her again, despite the doctor's assurance. "The bullet missed anything vital, but he lost a significant amount of blood," Dr. Miller explained quietly. "The next 24 hours will tell the tale. If infection doesn't set in, he should recover fully, though he'll have limited use of that arm for a while." Zara approached the table slowly, her eyes fixed on Garrett's face. "What can I do?" "Watch him, keep the wound clean, try to get some water into him when he starts to come around." The doctor gestured to a chair beside the table. "I'll be in the next room if his condition changes." Left alone with Garrett, Zara sank into the chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of the situation. He was alive, injured but alive. The relief was so profound that it left her light-headed. Hesitantly, she reached out to touch his hand where it lay at his side. His skin was cool but not cold, and when she curled her fingers around his, she could feel the steady pulse in his wrist. A tangible reminder that his heart still beat, that death had not claimed him as it had claimed David. "You promised to be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "This isn't what I would call keeping that promise." Of course, there was no response. His breathing remained deep and even, his features relaxed in drug-induced sleep. "The sheriff says you saved his life," she continued, speaking softly, finding comfort in the one-sided conversation. "That sounds like you. Always thinking of others before yourself." She squeezed his hand gently. "But who's going to help me with the dishes now? You've gotten me used to having help." The attempt at lightness failed as her voice broke on the last word. Help. Such a simple thing, but one she had refused for so long, convinced that independence was her only protection against the pain of loss. Yet here she was, facing that very pain again, despite all her efforts to avoid it. I was trying so hard not to care about you, she confessed, the words easier to say while he couldn't hear them. I thought if I kept my distance, kept everyone at arm's length, I could protect myself. But it didn't work. A tear slipped down her cheek. You got past my defenses somehow, with your kindness and your patience and the way you look at me like you can see all the broken pieces and don't mind them. She brushed the tear away with her free hand, keeping the other firmly wrapped around his. I don't know if I remember how to love someone, Garrett. It's been so long and I was so determined not to try again, but I think maybe I'm learning with you. The admission, spoken in the quiet of the surgery with only an unconscious man to hear it, nonetheless felt monumental, a turning point she could never take back. It terrified her and liberated her in equal measure. Throughout the night, Zara maintained her vigil, occasionally moistening Garrett's lips with water, checking his bandages as the doctor had shown her, and continuing her quiet monologue whenever the silence became too oppressive. She told him about David, about the life they had planned together, about the dark months after his death when she had wandered from town to town, unable to settle, afraid to form connections. She spoke of her arrival in Whispering Pines, of how Mrs. Holloway's kindness had given her a foothold in a world that had seemed determined to sweep her away. She described the careful way she had built her life here, focused on work and practical skills, avoiding anything that might make her vulnerable again. I can cook and clean, she murmured, smoothing a lock of hair from his forehead. Those are useful skills, necessary ones, but loving someone, that feels like luxury out here, a dangerous one, she sighed softly. Yet here I am anyway. Dawn was breaking when Garrett finally stirred, his eyelids fluttering before opening to reveal hazel eyes clouded with confusion and pain. He blinked several times, focusing on the ceiling, then turning his head slightly to find Zara sitting beside him, still holding his hand. Zara, his voice was a rough whisper, his throat dry from the laudanum. Relief flooded through her at the sound of her name on his lips. I'm here, she said, reaching for the cup of water she had kept ready. Try to drink a little. She supported his head gently as he took a few sips, grimacing as the movement jostled his injured shoulder. When she laid his head back down, his eyes found hers again, more lucid now. The sheriff. He's fine. Thanks to you, she set the cup aside. You saved his life. A faint smile touched his lips. Good, he paused, clearly trying to piece together what had happened. Blackwell. He escaped with one other, Zara's voice tightened. But they captured 3 of his gang. They're in jail. Garrett closed his eyes briefly, whether from disappointment or pain she couldn't tell. When he opened them again, he seemed to take in her appearance for the first time, the disheveled hair, the dark circles under her eyes, the wrinkled dress still damp from the previous night's rain. You've been here all night, he observed, his voice gaining strength. She nodded, suddenly self-conscious under his scrutiny. Someone needed to watch over you. And you volunteered, it wasn't a question. Yes. His gaze held hers, searching for something. Why? The simple question deserved a simple answer, but Zara found the words sticking in her throat. She had spoken them freely enough when he was unconscious. Why was it so difficult now that he could hear her? Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, she finally managed, her voice barely audible. Because somewhere along the way, despite my best efforts not to, I started to care about you. More than I should, more than is sensible out here. The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw. Garrett's expression softened, a warmth filling his eyes that had nothing to do with fever. I heard you, he said quietly. Last night, not everything, I think, but enough. Enough to know that you were talking to me, telling me things you might never have said if I'd been awake. Heat rose to Zara's cheeks. You weren't supposed to hear that. I'm glad I did. He squeezed her hand weakly. Because I've been trying to find a way to tell you the same thing, but you were so careful to keep your distance that I was afraid of pushing too hard, of making you retreat further. I was afraid, she admitted. I still am. When the sheriff came to the house and told me you'd been shot, she drew a shaky breath. It was like losing David all over again, the same terror, the same helplessness. But it wasn't the same, Garrett pointed out gently. I'm still here. This time, the fear that had been her constant companion for years surfaced again. But what about next time? Or the time after that? The frontier is dangerous, Garrett. People die out here every day. Yes, they do. His voice was steady despite his weakened state, which is precisely why closing yourself off from connection, from love, makes no sense. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste it being afraid to feel. The logic was simple but powerful, echoing what Mrs. Holloway had tried to tell her. Living in fear of loss meant not really living at all. When I was lying there after I was shot, Garrett continued, his gaze never leaving hers, do you know what I regretted most? Not telling you how I felt, not having the courage to break through your defenses sooner. He paused, gathering strength. I've been half in love with you since the first week I arrived, Zara. Since I saw how you moved through the world, competent, independent, carrying a sadness you never spoke of but never let defeat you. I was just surviving, she protested. No, the word was gentle but firm. You were doing more than surviving. You were caring for others, creating beauty in simple ways, making a life that mattered. You just wouldn't let yourself see it that way. His words touched something deep within her, a truth she had been unable or unwilling to acknowledge. She had seen her life in Whispering Pines as a pale shadow of what might have been, as mere existence. But through Garrett's eyes, it became something different, something with meaning and value beyond mere survival. Before she could respond, the door opened and Dr. Miller entered, looking pleased to find his patient awake and talking. Good morning, he said, moving to check Garrett's bandages. How's our hero feeling? Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, Garrett replied with a weak attempt at humor. The doctor nodded, unsurprised. That's to be expected. The laudanum will be wearing off, but I can give you more for the pain. Not yet, I need my head clear. Dr. Miller raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. As you wish, but don't try to be too heroic about it. Pain serves no useful purpose in healing. He turned to Zara. You look exhausted, Miss Kingsley. Why don't you go home and get some rest? I can take over now. The thought of leaving Garrett's side, even knowing he was out of immediate danger, filled Zara with irrational anxiety. I'd prefer to stay a bit longer if that's all right. The doctor exchanged a knowing look with Garrett. Very well, but at least let me have Mrs. Patterson bring you some breakfast. You won't be much help to anyone if you faint from hunger. After he left, a comfortable silence fell between Zara and Garrett, their hands still linked. The confession of feelings had changed something fundamental between them, a barrier dissolved that could never be rebuilt. You should get some rest, she finally said, noticing how the brief conversation had drained his energy. We can talk more when you're stronger. Garrett's eyes were already growing heavy, but he tightened his grip on her hand. Promise me something. What? Promise you won't retreat behind those walls again while I'm sleeping. Promise you'll still be here, really here, when I wake up. The request revealed his own vulnerability, his fear that her courage might fail in the face of what they had begun to acknowledge. Zara leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead, the first truly intimate gesture she had initiated between them. I promise, she whispered against his skin. I'll be here. His smile as he drifted back to sleep was worth every moment of terror she had endured through the night. The next week passed in a blur of activity for Zara. Garrett was moved from the doctor's office to his room at the boarding house once his condition stabilized, and she found herself dividing her time between her usual duties and caring for him. She brought him meals, changed his bandages, read to him when restlessness made him irritable, and simply sat with him when conversation became too taxing. Mrs. Holloway watched their growing closeness with quiet approval, occasionally stepping in to insist that Zara rest or eat when she seemed in danger of neglecting her own needs in favor of Garrett's. The other boarders took to teasing them gently about their obvious attachment, which Zara found herself able to accept with a grace that would have been impossible just weeks before. As Garrett's strength returned, their conversations deepened. They spoke of their pasts, her childhood in Pennsylvania as the daughter of a shopkeeper, his upbringing in Missouri with a father who valued education above all else. They shared dreams they had never voiced aloud to anyone else. Her secret wish to someday have a small homestead with a garden where she could grow herbs and vegetables. His desire to eventually have land of his own rather than always working for others. "I've saved nearly enough," he told her one evening as they sat together by the window in his room, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Another year at the Rocking M, and I could put a down payment on a small spread. Nothing fancy, but enough to start building something." The casual way he included her in this future vision, the use of we instead of I when discussing where the house might be built or how many cattle they might run, was both thrilling and terrifying to Zara. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the next day, the next week, the next season. "It sounds wonderful," she said softly, allowing herself to picture it, a small cabin with a porch where they might sit on summer evenings, fields where cattle grazed, perhaps even children someday running and laughing in the yard. Garrett reached for her hand, his touch now familiar and comforting. "But—" She smiled ruefully at how well he had come to read her in such a short time. "But I'm still afraid sometimes that I'll let myself believe in this future and then lose it all again." "That's natural." His voice was gentle, understanding. "Fear doesn't disappear overnight, not after what you've been through." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "But we can't let it dictate our choices. Not if we want to truly live." Each day, as Garrett grew stronger and their connection deepened, Zara felt the walls around her heart continuing to crumble. The process wasn't always smooth. There were moments of panic when the old fear would resurface, moments when the habit of emotional self-protection made her withdraw briefly. But Garrett was patient, understanding that healing wasn't a straight path but a winding one. 2 weeks after the shooting, Sheriff Davis brought news that the remaining members of the Blackwell gang, including Blackwell himself, had been captured by a U.S. Marshal near the territorial border. They would stand trial for multiple murders, including that of David. The knowledge brought Zara a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed, not the vengeful satisfaction she might once have imagined, but a quiet relief that at least one chapter of her past could finally be closed. That evening, after sharing the news with Garrett, she found herself talking more freely about David than she ever had before, not just about his death, but about his life, about who he had been, about the things she had loved about him. "He would have liked you," she said, surprising herself with the realization. "He valued honesty and kindness above all else." Garrett, now able to sit comfortably in the chair by the window, listened without jealousy or discomfort. "He sounds like a good man. I'm glad you had him in your life, even if it was for too short a time." The simple acknowledgement that David had been a blessing rather than just a source of pain, that her love for him had been valuable even though it ended in tragedy, helped Zara see her past in a new light. Her years with David weren't just a prelude to loss but a chapter of her life worth honoring, worth remembering with gratitude as well as sadness. By the end of the 3rd week, Garrett was well enough to move around the house, though the doctor still advised against returning to work for at least another week. His enforced idleness made him restless, and Zara often found him attempting tasks he wasn't yet strong enough for: chopping wood, carrying heavy objects, once even trying to fix a loose shutter on the 2nd floor until Mrs. Holloway caught him on the ladder and scolded him soundly. "You're a terrible patient," Zara told him after finding him in the stable grooming his horse when he was supposed to be resting. Dr. Miller said another week of limited activity. Garrett ran a hand down his horse's neck, his expression sheepish but unrepentant. "I'm not used to sitting around doing nothing. Makes me feel useless." Zara moved to stand beside him, tentatively placing her hand on his uninjured shoulder. Physical contact between them was still new territory, each touch a small act of courage on her part. "You're not useless," she said firmly. "You're healing, there's a difference." He turned to face her, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. "You're good for me, Zara Kingsley. You know that." She leaned into his touch, allowing herself to enjoy the warmth of his palm against her skin. "Someone has to keep you from doing foolish things like getting shot or climbing ladders with one good arm." His laugh was warm and rich, filling the stable with its sound. "I suppose that's true." His expression sobered slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you still afraid of this, of us?" The question caught her off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Garrett had always been direct in his communication, unwilling to leave important things unsaid. She considered her answer carefully. "Yes," she finally admitted, "not as much as before, but yes, I think some part of me will always be afraid of losing what I care about." She drew a deep breath. "But I'm more afraid of not trying. Of letting fear rob me of what could be." The smile that illuminated his face was worth every moment of vulnerability the admission had cost her. "That's all I needed to hear." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch of his lips against hers. It was their first kiss, and though she had imagined this moment many times over the past weeks, the reality was both simpler and more profound than her imagination had allowed. When he drew back, his eyes were warm with an emotion she no longer felt the need to deny. "I love you, Zara. I think I have since that first night in your kitchen, when you told me so firmly that your stew was nothing special, even though we both knew it was the best meal I'd had in years." The declaration, spoken so plainly, sent a surge of joy through her so intense it was almost painful. For a moment she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the emotional journey that had brought her from grief-stricken isolation to this moment of connection. "I love you too," she finally whispered, the words feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "God help me, I didn't want to, but I do." His laugh was gentle as he pulled her closer, mindful of his healing shoulder. "Not the most romantic declaration I've ever heard, but I'll take it." She smiled against his chest, breathing in the now familiar scent of him. "I'm out of practice with romance." "Well," he murmured against her hair, "we have plenty of time to work on that." The next morning, Zara rose early as usual to begin breakfast preparations. As she moved around the kitchen in the pre-dawn quiet, she found herself humming softly, a habit she had abandoned years ago that seemed to have returned without her conscious notice. The simple act felt symbolic somehow, a sign of the joy that had crept back into her life despite her best efforts to keep it at bay. She was so absorbed in her tasks and her thoughts that she didn't hear Garrett enter until his arms slipped around her waist from behind, startling her into a small gasp. "Good morning," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below her ear. "You shouldn't be up yet," she chided, though she made no move to pull away from his embrace. "And you startled me." "Sorry," he didn't sound particularly repentant. "I woke up and you weren't there. The house was too quiet without you." The casual intimacy of his words, the implication that her presence was now something he expected, something he missed when it was absent, warmed her from within. It had been so long since anyone had truly needed her, not just for what she could do but for who she was. She turned in his arms to face him, noting with approval that he looked stronger every day, the color returning to his face, the haunted look of pain gradually fading from his eyes. "Mrs. Holloway will have a fit if she catches you out of bed this early," she warned, though she couldn't keep the smile from her voice. "Worth the risk." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear in a gesture that had become dear to her. "I had a thought last night, something I wanted to ask you." "What's that?" "When I'm fully recovered and back at work," he began, a slight nervousness entering his voice, "would you consider coming out to the Rocking M on Sundays? Mr. Montgomery's wife has been asking to meet you, and there's something there I'd like to show you." Zara raised an eyebrow, curious. "What sort of something?" A surprise, his smile was boyish, almost mischievous. "Will you come?" The old Zara would have hesitated, would have found reasons to refuse, would have protected herself from the unknown. But the woman she was becoming, the woman who was learning to trust again, to hope again, to love again, found herself nodding without reservation. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." His smile was worth every moment of fear she had overcome to reach this point. It was another 2 weeks before Dr. Miller declared Garrett fit enough to return to light duties at the ranch, though he still cautioned against any strenuous activity that might reopen the wound or strain the healing muscle. The foreman's position at the Rocking M involved more supervision than physical labor, making it possible for Garrett to resume at least part of his responsibilities while continuing to heal. The day of their planned Sunday visit to the ranch dawned clear and bright, the air carrying the first hints of autumn crispness. Zara dressed with more care than usual, selecting her best dress, a deep blue cotton that Mrs. Holloway insisted brought out her eyes, and arranging her hair in a more elaborate style than her usual practical bun. When she came downstairs, Garrett was waiting by the front door, his own appearance more formal than she was accustomed to seeing. He wore a clean white shirt with a leather vest, his usual work denims replaced by darker trousers, his boots polished to a shine. He had even trimmed his hair, which had grown somewhat shaggy during his recovery. "You look beautiful," he said simply when he saw her, the admiration in his eyes making her blush. "Thank you," she accepted his offered arm. "You clean up quite nicely yourself." The ride to the Rocking M took nearly an hour, but Zara hardly noticed the time passing. Garrett had borrowed a buggy from the livery rather than having her ride behind him on horseback, and as they traveled, he pointed out landmarks and shared stories about his work on the ranch. His enthusiasm was contagious, and Zara found herself drawn into his vision of the land and its possibilities. The Rocking M itself was impressive, one of the largest spreads in the area, with a substantial main house, bunkhouse, barns, and corrals spread across a gentle slope overlooking a creek. Cattle grazed in the distance, and several cowboys were visible even on this day of rest, tending to essential chores. Mrs. Montgomery greeted them warmly on the porch of the main house, a handsome woman in her 40s with a practical manner that immediately put Zara at ease. Mr. Montgomery was equally welcoming, expressing his gratitude for Garrett's quick recovery and making it clear how valued the young foreman was to their operation. After a generous meal and several hours of pleasant conversation, Garrett suggested showing Zara around the property. They excused themselves, and he led her toward his horse, which had been saddled and was waiting at the hitching post. "I thought we might ride out a ways," he explained. "There's something I want you to see." Zara eyed the horse dubiously, both of us on one horse. His smile was reassuring as he helped her up, then mounted behind her, his arms encircling her to take the reins. "It's not far, and Domino here is the steadiest mount on the ranch." The feeling of being surrounded by Garrett's warmth, the solid press of his chest against her back as the horse moved beneath them, created a sense of security she hadn't expected. She gradually relaxed into the rhythm of the ride, enjoying the closeness and the beautiful landscape unfolding around them. They rode for perhaps 15 minutes, cresting a small hill and following a well-worn trail that paralleled the creek. Finally, Garrett guided the horse to a stop in a small clearing overlooking a bend in the water, where the land formed a natural plateau. "This is what I wanted to show you," he said, his voice close to her ear. Zara looked around, taking in the peaceful setting. Cottonwood trees lined the creek, their leaves beginning to turn gold with the approaching autumn. The ground was relatively flat but elevated enough to provide protection from spring floods. A natural meadow stretched behind them, ringed by gentle slopes that would offer shelter from the prevailing winds. "It's beautiful," she said truthfully. "Is this part of the Rocking M?" "Yes and no." Garrett dismounted, then reached up to help her down. "It's on Montgomery's land, but it's not being used for grazing or crops. It's too small for either to be worthwhile." He took her hand, leading her toward the edge of the plateau where the view was best. "But it would be perfect for a homestead." The significance of his words slowly dawned on her. A homestead. Garrett nodded, a mixture of nervousness and hope in his expression. "Montgomery has offered to sell me this parcel, 50 acres, including water rights to the creek. It's not enough for a proper ranch, but with my position at the Rocking M secure, it would be a place to build a home. A future." Zara's heart began to race as she realized what he was saying. "Garrett." "I know it's soon," he hurried on, his words tumbling over each other. "We've only known each other a few months. But when I was lying there after being shot, thinking I might die, I realized how precious time is, How foolish it would be to waste it on unnecessary waiting when we both know what we want. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. I love you, Zara. I want to build a life with you right here if you like the spot. A small house to start, something we can expand as needed. A garden for you to grow those herbs you're always talking about. Maybe someday children playing by the creek. The vision he painted was so close to the one she had begun to allow herself to imagine that it took her breath away. You're asking me to marry you, she said, needing to hear the words directly. Yes, he reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the sunlight. I am asking you to marry me. The ring he held was simple but beautiful, a silver band with a small sapphire that matched the blue of her eyes. Not an expensive piece, but one chosen with obvious care. It was my mother's, he explained. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for the woman I wanted to spend my life with. He took a deep breath. That's you, Zara, if you'll have me. Zara looked from the ring to his face, seeing the love and hope and nervous anticipation written there. 3 months ago, such an offer would have sent her running in the opposite direction, retreating behind the walls she had built to protect herself from further pain. But the woman standing on this hillside was not the same woman who had watched Garrett Irwin climb down from the stagecoach that summer day. This woman had learned that walls could imprison as well as protect. That safety sometimes came at too high a price, that the possibility of loss was the inevitable companion of love, but that the absence of love was a loss already realized. When I first came to Whispering Pines, she said slowly, holding his gaze, I thought all I had to offer anyone was practical skills. I could cook and clean and mend and garden, useful things, necessary things, but love, she shook her head. I convinced myself that love was a luxury I couldn't afford, that it was safer to remain alone than to risk my heart again. Garrett listened intently, the ring still held between them, a symbol of all that was being offered and all that was at stake. Then you arrived, she continued, and no matter how hard I tried to keep my distance, you kept finding ways past my defenses. Not by forcing them down, but by showing me, day after day, that there was another way to live. That connection was worth the risk. She drew a shaky breath. I can cook and clean, but I thought I couldn't love anymore. You proved me wrong. She extended her left hand, steady despite the emotions coursing through her. Yes, Garrett Irwin. I will marry you. I will build a life with you on this hillside. I will plant gardens and bake bread in our own kitchen and sleep beside you every night, knowing that each moment we have together is precious, regardless of how many or how few were granted. The joy that transformed his face was the most beautiful thing Zara had ever seen. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground, his laugh echoing across the hillside. You've made me the happiest man in the territory, he said when he finally set her down, his voice husky with emotion. And you've taught me that happiness is still possible, she replied, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. Even after the worst happens, even on the frontier where nothing is certain except change. She smiled through the happy tears that had begun to fall. That's a gift beyond price. Their kiss beneath the cottonwoods sealed the promise, not just of marriage, but of a shared journey forward. Whatever the frontier might bring, bounty or hardship, joy or sorrow, they would face it together. Two souls who had found in each other not just practical partnership, but the deeper connection that made life worth living, whatever its duration. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Zara Kingsley became Zara Irwin in a ceremony at the church in Whispering Pines. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the building overflowing with people who had watched their romance unfold and had invested in its happy conclusion. Mrs. Holloway wept openly as she straightened Zara's veil one last time before the ceremony, proclaiming her as beautiful a bride as I've ever seen. The dress was simple but elegant, sewn by Zara herself with help from the other women in town, white cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, the color setting off her honey blonde hair, which she wore partially up with soft curls framing her face. When she walked down the aisle on Mr. Peterson's arm, the older man having volunteered to stand in for her late father, Zara's eyes found Garrett waiting at the altar. The love and wonder in his expression as he watched her approach made every difficult step of her journey worthwhile. Every tear she had shed, every moment of grief she had endured, every fear she had confronted. For here she was, walking toward a future she had once believed impossible, her heart open and ready for whatever life might bring. Not because she was certain of a happy outcome, the frontier offered no such guarantees, but because she had learned that a life unlived out of fear was no life at all. The vows they exchanged were traditional but spoken with a depth of meaning that brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up seemed to lift the roof of the small church. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and joyful toasts to the couple's future. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit in the town hall where the festivities continued, Garrett pulled Zara aside for a moment of quiet amidst the revelry. "Happy Mrs. Irwin?" he asked, his arms around her waist, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the lanterns. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully, marveling at how far she had come from the wounded, isolated woman who had believed herself incapable of loving again, and a little terrified. His smile was understanding. "That's how you know it matters." She nodded, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "When do we start building our home?" "As soon as the ground thaws in spring." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Montgomery's given me the next 3 days off, but then I'll be back to work, saving every penny for lumber and supplies. By this time next year, we'll be celebrating Christmas in our own house." The vision filled Zara with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crowded hall or the dancing they had just left. Their own home, their own future, built with their own hands on land they would make fruitful through hard work and determination. "I can't wait to plant that garden," she said, her mind already filling with plans. "And to see you sitting on our porch in the evening, watching the sunset over the creek. And maybe someday watching our children play in the yard," he added softly, the hope in his voice matching the dream she had begun to nurture in her own heart. "Yes," she agreed, tilting her face up to his. "Someday." As they rejoined the celebration, moving together in a slow dance as the fiddle played a sentimental tune, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of grief to the heights of joy, from isolation to connection, from survival to living, the path had not been straight or easy. The wounds of her past would always be part of her, scars that might ache when storms approached. But they no longer defined her or limited what she allowed herself to feel, to hope for, to believe in. "I love you," she whispered to her husband as they danced beneath the rafters of the small town hall, surrounded by people who had become family. Not just for today, but for all the days were granted, however many that might be. His answering smile was everything she had never dared to wish for after David's death, a promise, not of forever, which no one on the frontier could honestly make, but of now, of today, of a love that would endure as long as breath remained. "And I love you," he replied, his voice carrying the same certainty that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "For the woman you are, the woman you were, and the woman you'll become as we build this life together." In that moment, with snowflakes beginning to fall gently outside the windows and the community celebrating around them, Zara knew she had found not just love again, but home, that elusive state of belonging she had sought since childhood. Intensified by loss, and finally discovered in the most unexpected of places. In the heart of a cowboy who had seen her walls and patiently, kindly, persistently shown her a better way to live. She had come to the frontier believing it was a place where dreams came to die, where only practical skills mattered, where love was a luxury too dangerous to afford. She had been wrong. The frontier was harsh, yes, and unforgiving of weakness. But it was also a place where the human spirit could triumph over adversity, where community could mean the difference between life and death, and where love, genuine, enduring love, might be the most practical skill of all. 5 years later, on a warm spring evening, Zara sat on the porch of the house she and Garrett had built together, watching as her husband taught their 3-year-old son to ride his first pony. Little David, named for the man whose memory Zara now honored without pain, shrieked with delight as the gentle animal plodded in a circle, his father's strong hands ensuring he couldn't fall. Inside, their infant daughter slept peacefully in the cradle Garrett had carved during the long winter evenings, her tiny features a perfect blend of her parents'. The garden Zara had planted their first spring had expanded each year, and now provided not just herbs and vegetables for their table, but enough surplus to sell in town. The 50 acres they had started with had grown to 80 with the purchase of an adjacent parcel, and though Garrett still worked as foreman at the Rocking M, they were slowly building their own small herd. Life was not without its challenges. 2 harsh winters had tested their resources and resolve. A prairie fire had threatened their home in their second year, and the everyday hardships of frontier life, isolation during storms, limited medical care, the constant work required to maintain even basic comfort were ever-present realities. But they faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome. The love that had seemed so dangerous to Zara once had proven to be her greatest strength, her most reliable ally in building a life worth living. As the sun began to set over their little valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Garrett lifted their son from the pony and walked toward the porch, the boy chattering excitedly about his adventure. Zara's heart swelled with a happiness so complete it still sometimes took her by surprise. "Did you see me, Mama?" David called as they approached. "I rode all by myself." "I saw my brave boy," she replied, opening her arms to receive him as Garrett set him down on the porch steps. "You're a natural horseman, just like your father." Garrett joined her on the bench, slipping an arm around her shoulders as David raced off to examine a fascinating beetle he had spotted in the yard. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Irwin," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Zara leaned into his embrace, watching their son's explorations with contented eyes. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, how different my life is from what I expected when I first arrived in Whispering Pines." "Better or worse?" he asked, though the twinkle in his eye suggested he knew the answer. "Infinitely better." She turned to meet his gaze, still finding the same warmth there that had first begun to thaw her frozen heart years ago. "I thought I knew what happiness was once. I was wrong. This, what we've built together, is beyond anything I could have imagined." He nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "You know, I never told you this, but that first night at Mrs. Holloway's, when you said that stew was nothing special, even though it was the best meal I'd had in years, I knew then that you were someone extraordinary. Someone who created beauty without acknowledging it, who gave without expectation of return." "I was just doing my job," she protested, echoing her words from that long-ago evening. "No," his voice was gentle but firm. "You were doing much more than that. You were pouring love into everything you touched, even while denying that you were capable of it." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as tender as it had been the first time. "You told me once that you could cook and clean but not love. You were wrong about that last part." Zara smiled at the memory of her own stubborn resistance. "Fortunately for both of us." From inside the house came the first faint cries of their daughter, awakening from her nap. David, hearing his sister, abandoned his beetle to race up the steps, announcing, "Baby's awake, I'll get her." "Gently," Zara called after him, though she knew he was always careful with the infant he had declared himself protector of from the moment she was born. As Garrett helped her to her feet, his hand lingering in hers, she took in the scene around them. The home they had built with their own hands, the children they had created together, the land they had made productive through shared labor. All of it born from a love she had once believed herself incapable of feeling again. "What do you think about adding that second bedroom this summer?" Garrett asked as they walked toward the door, the question practical but laden with the promise of continued growth, continued building, continued life together. "I think it's time," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "This family isn't getting any smaller." His answering smile was all the confirmation she needed that the journey they had begun 5 years ago was nowhere near its end, that there were still dreams to pursue, challenges to face, joys to discover together. And while the frontier remained as unpredictable and sometimes harsh as ever, they would meet whatever came their way with the strength that came from knowing they were not alone. For Zara had learned the most valuable lesson the West had to teach. That love, genuine, enduring love, was not a luxury but a necessity, not a weakness but the greatest strength of all. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built, the hearth around which a true home gathered, the legacy that would outlast even the most carefully constructed walls and roofs and fences. As they stepped into their house together to attend to their children, the setting sun cast long golden rays through the windows, illuminating the simple, beautiful life they had created, a testament to the truth that had transformed Zara's world and that continued to guide their path forward. Some things, once broken, could be rebuilt stronger than before. Some hearts, once shattered, could learn to love more deeply for having known loss. And sometimes, the most practical skill of all was the courage to risk everything for love.